take a few moments and do a little bit of discussion of a couple of things related to Pesach and maybe the Haftarah and possibly the Torah portion. We'll see. We're running
we got big ambitions.
Big ambitions. We're running very early this morning. Really. Well, that's done. So maybe we'll start with Elijah the prophet, the great figure of Elijah, continuing the theme that you find towards the end of this morning's Haftarah. Of course, Elijah will appear at our Seders tonight. Very dramatic moment. I think one of the most dramatic moments at the Seder when the door opens and the sense of what's there, what's on the other side, hope, expectation, looking towards the future, all kinds of things. And of course, Elijah is understood as a figure of transition in the tradition. Elijah appears 3 times throughout the year. Elijah appears, of course, tonight at the Seder, tomorrow night at the Seder. I count that as 1, Passover. Elijah appears also at every bris. At every bris, Elijah's at every bris. Remember, the baby is placed in Kisei Shel Eliyahu, the chair of Elijah before the bris, and Elijah appears at every Havdalah. Havdalah, right, because Pesach is transitioning from slavery to freedom. Havdalah is transitioning from Shabbat back to the workday week. And of course, the bris, the baby, is transitioning from being outside the covenant to being inside the covenant. Any Elijah thoughts going into tonight?
It's no Jeremiah.
He's no Jeremiah. Who is, though?
Right.
Who is?
You know,
Elijah? Okay, what's the other time? Announce the coming of the Messiah.
Yeah, but that's only one time.
Yeah, but yes.
So I would say that, I think that Eliyahu is a really interesting figure, but also in some ways an interesting concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That in many ways, sometimes we live in a world that feels like it's flipped upside down and you can't imagine how this is going to get better. And you can sort of apply that to so many different, areas of the world as it is today. But I think that one of the things that's so powerful about the idea of Eliyahu and also just the sort of a messianic redemption, if you will, is this idea that there could very well be a way, I guess, out, right, that doesn't have anything to do with us, but sometimes we have to act as if we have the power to change the world as it is. So I guess in some ways, Eliyahu and the Mashiach both, I think, give me a bit of hope that something outside of us that we can't even imagine could potentially happen that would change the world as we know it for the better.
Yeah, I've always seen Eliyahu as sort of like the national conscience of the Jewish people. You know, all those like Hasidic stories where it's like an old man and you do a mitzvah and it turns out it's Eliyahu, right? Because he's supposed to teach us to be good people, to do good things, and the only way Messianic era will be ushered in is if we learn to love each other and stop hating each other. And Eliyahu, as harbinger of the Mashiach, sort of, makes us think about what kind of people we should be and how to behave properly. And so I always saw him as sort of like that national conscience, checking in on us at the Seder to see how we're doing.
So it's an interesting question that, sort of this idea of when we open the door, right? In some ways it challenges us, I feel like almost to think about, do we open the door with a sense of hopefulness, right? That you don't.
No, I don't.
Do you?
I do, yeah, I do. And I mean, for me, to get back to Ben's point, it really is, I think Judaism's whole thing is, trust but verify, So yeah, that you trust that somehow that will happen, that a messianic era will arrive, but you better do what you can to make sure that happens. Don't sit around and say, it'll just happen in a miraculous kind of way. No, that's not Judaism's approach. And opening the door is an action. You know,
Yeah.
and it's an action that takes this intimate moment, which is
Yeah.
in your home with family and friends, and kind of creates this liminal space between that moment and what's out there. As dangerous as that may seem sometime, but that you have to keep that connection. You have to keep that door open.
And it's an interesting thing as you say that about action, because one of the things that we say earlier on in the Seder is like, may all who are hungry come and eat.
For sure.
Right? So there's sort of that sense of like, we're doing our part and we're not going to, like, we're also going to have hope that God will do God's part. It's almost, this and.
That's a very, I think, one of the most, what were you saying, Ben?
I think that, there's a bit of buy-in on both sides, right? We have to do it, but also God has to fulfill God's end of the covenant as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the most profound moments of the Seder, actually,
Yeah.
is, that we invite those who do not have to the Seder.
Yeah.
And it's all, by the way, what do we offer them? We say, all who don't have enough food, come and eat with us. What are we offering them? In that moment, matzah.
Not so generous.
Oh, matzah is bread
Bread
of
of affliction and
freedom also.
So it's an interesting question, though, right? That idea. I always feel a little bit torn when we do that, because the truth is that when we like shout out in our neighborhoods, let all who are hungry come and eat, and like we know there's no one outside, it almost feels like that mitzvah should be extended prior to that moment in time, just given the way that,
Right.
Unless people at one point were sort of like standing out waiting for that invitation,
Right.
which could very well be, but it feels now like it's sort of a going through the motions, but a beautiful reminder of our obligations in the world to.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think it's working symbolically. Yeah. I mean, so again, like you're come and have matzah. Oh, thanks a lot. And what about the brisket? What about but Primo Levi
Yeah.
has an astonishing sort of memory around the days before they were liberated from the concentration camps, and he's with prisoners. The Germans had left, and there's no one there. And he's in this area of the camp where there's a stove, and it's freezing cold. And they figure out a way to get the stove to begin to work. And then there's one of the prisoners that has a little bit of bread, and bread, right, matzah essentially. And the prisoner offers a little bit of the bread that he had to one of the other prisoners. And it's the first time that any of them could conceive of the idea of sharing food with someone else. And Primo Levi wrote, at that moment we knew we were free. Because if we could share food with another, that meant that we had a sense of security and a sense of God in our lives. And so you start the Seder that way. If you know you can offer matzah to even matzah, if you can offer that to another,
Yeah,
right? That
I
sort
love
of sets the table there.
It's an interesting thing when you said that. It reminded me that, some of the testimonials that we have now of those who are coming out of captivity. I was just reading the story of two of the young women that were being held captive in Gaza, two Israeli women, and they said that last year at Pesach, and it's hard to imagine that many of these guys, mostly sort of, in the 20 to 24 range, are going to be there for a second year of Pesach as captives. But one of the things that this particular piece that I was reading said was that the two young women that were being held in captivity last Pesach, that they were sort of on the ground together, and they were trying, by remembering to have their own, Passover Seder, albeit without food, but they were telling the story and they were trying to go through what they remembered of the Haggadah. And I just think, like, in some ways, with 59 people, 25 perhaps, please God, still alive, being held, like, it just resonates so deeply that, like, in some ways the importance of us who are free and are able to, like, not take that for granted tonight and tomorrow.
Yeah, certainly lends a different resonance to it. Yeah. And just the last Elijah piece is that, so commonly we focus on the first half of the Seder, and the Elijah moment really happens at it's sort of the beginning of the second half of the Seder, but a lot of folks never do much in the second half of the Seder. But that's a crucial. I'm just saying, but that's a crucial moment because that really the first half of the Seder. We talked about this in Talmud class the other night. The first half of the Seder is about the past, but it's the second half of the Seder that's about the future and the Messianic era, and that turning happens with opening the door for Elijah.
Can we talk a little bit about that second part of the Seder?
Yeah.
So I think part of the reason that people sometimes overlook it is that it's after the meal.
For sure.
And so people are like, they feel nourished and they're ready to go and the
Sleep
time is late. But that is where it becomes, I think, really hopeful and happy and, sort of inspiring.
Yeah, but it doesn't start out that way. Right? It starts out with that shvoch hamatcha. And the idea of opening that door is sort of it's a two-way door, right? There's this door of hopefulness, but also we're opening that door to condemn our enemies, essentially. And there's an idea that opening
do you
that
love
door.
that part?
It's my favorite part of the Seder, in fact. Thank you for asking. But there is this idea that the opening of the door actually comes from medieval times during anti-Semitic pogrom time, where Jews were sort of forced to keep the door open to let our Christian neighbors know that we weren't actually sacrificing children and using their blood to make matzah. So, when I open the door, I always think of that, sad time in our history, and I'm thinking a lot about it today in terms of anti-Semitism that is going around the world. So, yeah, that door is sort of like a two-way door. You have to look at the world as it is, but also you can look at the door and open it and see it the other way and what could be in this Messianic age as well. But it doesn't start out, so great. But as you move forward, it's an interesting liturgical switch to start out with that sort of harshness, but move into this idea of Sheva, this praise for God and this joyful, hopeful, and all the great songs at the end are really lovely. But it's this idea of going up, liturgically. It's a nice idea.
Nishmat Kol Chai, right? In the traditional Haggadah.
It's beautiful. It's a really it's a lovely way that
Hallel.
it was constructed.
Most of the Hallel service is at that point as well.
What are your favorite parts what are you most looking forward to as sort of a section tonight as a part of Passover? And that might be liturgically or in general.
Ben?
Besides the Shvoch HaMatcha part? I really like the Torah and Midrash section of the Haggadah. A lot of people skip it, but I like to go all through it and, to see those stories. Because, the Haggadah is about telling our story, the Jewish people's story. And I like to start from the beginning and, go all the way through. And it's nice. I like that part.
Which Haggadah do you use, Ben?
Tonight we'll be using 30 different Haggadahs. But the Haggadah that I really enjoy a lot is the Conservative Movement's Feast of Freedom. It's a great Haggadah. Or the Sarajevo text is really nice.
I always like first of all, I think it's worth noting that the Haggadah is probably the most familiar Jewish text.
Yeah.
I think of any Jewish text. Because we don't really know, a lot of Jews, we don't know the Bible very well, by and large. Torah we know pretty well, but most of the Bible no. And the Haggadah, people really have memories of it, resonates. If you say, oh, there's this and that, they say, oh yeah, I know that that's there. One of my favorite sections, year in and year out, well, the two that I really love. One is the story of the five rabbis in
Me
Bnei
too.
Barak. I love that story.
Do you believe it was because they were plotting?
No.
You don't believe that?
No.
Really?
That's a long conversation, but and then I also love the little snippet of the Hillel sandwich right before you eat. It has the resonance of how ancient that tradition is and how long Jews have been doing that. I was thinking about that today, looking through some of the text. If you look at the text like the Haftarah for tomorrow morning, and that within already the biblical text, so like Joshua's tomorrow morning's Haftarah, they're already talking and it's all the time about Pesach, all the time, and it just says to me that, and that's in the Bible already, right? And that just says to me that Jews have been engaged in the ideas of Pesach going back many thousands of years. I mean, 3,000 years or maybe more than that. astonishing.
It's very powerful.
Thing. Yeah, yeah. How about you? B'nai Barak.
Yeah, it's funny. I always love that little scene.
What's compelling about it?
So
If
much.
they're not plotting, yeah, what is?
So I actually think it's interesting that you're talking about a plot. So look, I think at one point I was like, oh my gosh, it's a sleepover party, and I really like sleepover parties, so that was sort of fun.
But nobody's sleeping.
But they're not sleeping; they're up all night until someone comes knocking at their door saying it's time for the morning shema. Um, so I do, look, I think one of the things that I really like, I've always liked about it is this idea that no matter how much you learn, or how learned you are,
Right.
you could still be up all night long
Right.
talking about the story.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I love that, but then later on, I loved this idea that, sort of given the historical context of it, that all of these rabbis went to sort of their student, a disciple's home, and that disciple was Rabbi Akiva's home. And they went there because he was someone who had hope, or was like good at hope. Was it Rabbi Akiva's house that they went to? What
Doesn't
did they
I
say.
don't think it
And,
doesn't
Right.
say
Doesn't
whose
say.
house
so
it actually
I think
was.
there's a rabbinic, I don't know if it's a midrash somewhere that says that they went to study at his home. But the idea that I think is so interesting is that, like, in times like this, to your point, Ben, you asked if I thought they were plotting or if we thought they were plotting. I feel like these were rabbis that were gathering together at a time where life was pretty tough for the Jewish people, and they were scared of what was to come. And I think in some ways, there may have been an element of really having a lot to talk about,
Sure.
in the world outside, and how the impact of the Jewish people. And I feel like that tonight. Like, I feel like there's so much for us to talk about at our Seder tables tonight about what's happening in the world vis-a-vis the Jews. And I'm eager to have those conversations with this group of people that will gather, but also I don't know, in so many ways, like, to be able to transmit the story and the importance of the Jewish traditions and the importance of, like, why is Judaism worth fighting for? Like, I feel like right now, if nothing else gets accomplished except to figure, I don't know, to share the why, I feel like that's almost like a Dayenu moment to me. There's a lot of battlefields right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I think that's a nice place to wrap it up, because what's the pasuk, which comes from Exodus 12, one of the longer chapters in the Torah, and it's the middle of all the verses in that chapter, which is it's Passover material, Maha avodah hazot lachem, meaning what does all of this mean to you? And that's your job when you sit down tonight and tomorrow night at the Seder tables, to convey to others, not only children, not only grandchildren, by the way, but to others who are sharing that moment with you. This is what this means to me. This is why this is important. This is why I do this. This is why I come and sit in shul week in and week out. This is why I'm celebrating this holiday. This is what it's all about. So hope we all have those opportunities tonight for wonderful Seders with family and with friends at a very important time for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people. But thanks as always for taking some time with us and doing a little bit of study, chatting, and we're on to Musaf.